Hello, welcome back. This week's episode is a continuation of last week's episode about intentional living. When I was planning and thinking about my episodes and thinking about intentional living, I thought about how I can't talk about intentional living without discussing being on autopilot. To be on autopilot means to act without thinking about what you're doing. It's essentially the opposite of intentional living, since intentional living is all about being purposeful with your actions and doing actions of value for yourself. While autopilot is not essentially all bad, because there are parts of our lives where just doing instead of having to think about the action serves us more, since we would have more space to think about the parts of our lives that are more bigger picture instead of fixating on the details. So for example, like something like brushing your teeth, you know to do that when you wake up, and doing that little routine in the morning would be a beneficial type of autopilot. But like everything, between intentional living and being on autopilot, there needs to be a balance. Even if we want to live intentionally, that there are still aspects of our lives that we have to do, regardless of if it's something we want to do or not want to do, because it's our responsibility. Intentional living, even if part of your life is not something you necessarily value a lot, but if it's a part of a bigger picture and you have to do it anyways. So that is kind of what I'm getting at, where sometimes with the details you have to be on autopilot, but then when it comes to other actions that actually contribute to the future you want, being intentional is very important. So I'm gonna spend this episode listing out some signs that you're living on autopilot. Let's just jump right in. So the first sign I said was mental constipation. And yes, that's a term I like to use when basically mentally you are feeling so overwhelmed and sometimes panicked and not know why. Your thoughts are just very unclear. I think with autopilot, it's like because there's a disconnection. You are doing things, you're not paying attention, and you don't have awareness of why you're doing it in the first place. So then when you're just kind of caught in the rut of doing whatever you're doing, but you are not necessarily paying attention to what exactly you're doing and how it's making you feel, because the worst you can do is be on autopilot in terms of your emotions. So not paying attention to how something makes you feel, and you're just going about it because quote unquote, that's just life. I do think people have a tendency to say that a lot, like, oh, well, that's life. But no one ever tells you, like, why do they believe that's life? It's just how things have always been done, and they consider that life because they never tried to do anything differently, and they've been living on autopilot mode. So honestly, that's one of the more frustrating sayings that I personally hate, especially when you ask someone like, why do you have to do things this way instead of like another way, or if there's another way, and they say, well, that's just life. It's just, sometimes I think in our society that we say that's life to things that are traditional, but we don't consider how the advances we made in technology and all these other things allowed it for us not for it to just be like, oh, that's life. Because I just find it so weird that the things that are convenient for us, like for example, like going out and like, let's say you have an office job, you do things more of convenience than because of it's actually purposeful. You know what I mean? So you need energy to work, right? So you do the convenient thing of buying food out. And I did that a lot in terms of school. Like, it was more convenient for me because then I wouldn't have to wake up extra early. I wouldn't have to think about meal prepping. I wouldn't need to plan. And then a lot of times I would end up not feeling as good throughout my day, and then wonder why I can't sleep at night. Maybe I had coffee later in the day because I didn't get a good sleep the night before because I was anxious about something. But I choose to do the Band-Aid thing and get a coffee. And then because I'm having coffee late in the evening because I feel like I need to stay awake for my evening class, then I'm just like overwhelmed and panicked by time I get home because the coffee didn't leave my system because I had it too late in the day. And then the cycle continues of me not sleeping well and having all these overwhelming feelings and not knowing what exactly it's stemming from. Because, of course, yes, on hindsight, part of it is probably school, but the way I go about to operate is a huge contribution to that. And then it affects how I show up in school, which makes me more anxious. But I wasn't really thinking about all that. I thought I just need to have the energy and the focus. So I would choose the convenient thing to do that, even though it wasn't helping, because it was more like a thoughtless action of what can actually help and not help. This goes on to the second sign because what I put down was being restless or low energy. I feel like when you're on autopilot, because you're not seeing your actions clearly, this kind of is more of a continuation, but you're not able to pay attention to how things are really affecting you. And then you end up having sleepless nights and then continuation cycle of low energy. So I kind of touched on this one a little bit at the last point, but even for me, there are points of the month where I feel like I'm a lot more restless, and it's usually when the moon phases change. I don't know if this is gonna be TMI, but for me, for example, I get my cycle every time on the full moon cycle. So leading up to the full moon and on the full moon and a little bit after, I'm just very restless. And during the new moon, I'm constantly tired. And I don't know what's actually contributing to that besides, the obvious of my own personal cycles of life, but also my actions throughout the day during those times. If I'm not really being purposeful and working with my energy instead of working against myself, it makes things a lot worse. Which is why it's so important for me to pay attention to what I'm doing and my daily activities, including my workouts, including what I'm eating, including the times I go to bed, and if I'm spending too much time sitting or not spending enough time outside, like all those things, and paying deeply attention to my actions make a huge difference of whether I'm restless and low energy or if I have a more balanced way of being. Okay, and sign number 3 is the tendency to be short with people. Have you ever been very reactive and you don't know why you're reacting that way? It's not always about what the person did or said. You just didn't think about what you were saying back to them. So the tendency to be short with someone is to respond, but not respond in a way that is thoughtful to another person. Like it lacks empathy or sympathy. It lacks kindness. And even if it's someone asking you a question of, oh, hey, do you know where this thing is? And you just snap and your tone of voice changes. That is a sign of being on autopilot because you're irritated, you're having emotions, but without actually feeling them and thinking about what you're actually saying, you're just reacting. And reactions without thought could be very consequential. You don't know another person's response, how a person will respond to your reaction, and they may react in a way that's negative too, and then it just becomes this co-creation of negativity, of impulsivity, because you're acting without thinking. You're acting, responding without actually taking a moment to be purposeful with the interaction. Number 4, I wrote down constantly feeling unsatisfied with things that you either saw as a success or what people would call a success. This one I thought about because I was listening to a podcast. I think it was called the health cafe with Vanessa. I can't remember her last name right now, but the episode I just randomly clicked on was her post-grad episode, and she's talking about her own post-grad experience, and I related to it so much, except for the part that she said she's engaged and she's now in that sector of her life. But she also talked about wanting to go back to school because of missing the structure of school, even though she was so ready to graduate, and she thought about doing more schooling, not because of what she wants to do as a career, but because when you're in your post-grad, at first it's exciting because of the possibilities, but then especially if you can't find work and you're constantly being told no, or you're getting rejected, or you even leave school was like, okay, I liked learning about it, because this is what she said. She was like, sometimes people like learning about something, but it's not necessarily what they want to do with their lives outside of school and to do as work. And I didn't finish listening to the episode because it was like an impulse listen while I could not fall asleep at night. And so it was an impulse listen because I figured listening to a podcast and cleaning my room would have been a much better, I guess, remedy to not being able to sleep, because I tried reading a book. I tried reading a nonfiction book, and that just made me think about things more. So that's what I ended up doing, because I didn't want to end up either in a YouTube hole or a scrolling hole on TikTok. So I was like, you know what, let me get up. My room needs cleaning. I was going to clean it anyways today. So it just took some of the things off my list. That's how I ended up listening to the podcast episode. And I had like thoughts about it, like, because it resonated to what I was reading, because I'm reading a book called The 20-Something Treatment, which is all about how in your 20s it's actually so normal to be uncertain, and that uncertainty is the most common feeling of being in your 20s. But the book talks about strategies to solve your problems. And when I left off, I was reading the chapter about working, and that then made my thoughts, of all areas of life, work is my sore spot. And I never understood like why it was such a sore spot for me, because clearly I did work before and worked at different points in my life. It's not like, oh, after college it's my first time having a job or doing some type of work for other people. But it's more of the fact that when it came to work, the thought process was, I just want a job so I can have money, so I can help my mom. And I never was really intentional about, like, I thought about doing things I like, but there's such a difference between what you like doing for especially yourself. For example, like for me, I love writing, I love creating, but I can't imagine doing that for a company. But I understood what I would be comfortable creating for a company or doing for work is leaning more into educational content, because with my last role, one thing I created on the job, and it was my favorite part about working, was I made basically a financial wellness workbook. And for me, making something like that and like designing things like that, it felt very right for me, because I do care about education, but I don't want to necessarily be a teacher. And I like teaching or creating things for things that are not necessarily for things taught in school, but for the improvement of people. Like, for example, like my favorite part about learning about beauty was not so much the actual creation of the products. I liked knowing how to make them, but I was not a hands-on person. And I also liked learning about the factual behind the scene things, like with the FDA, how they categorize products, the different types of products, like basically the nerdier parts of it. I liked understanding how things came to be and how the industry takes inspiration from things from historical contexts and the other parts about ingredients such as sourcing, the environmental issues that come with that and stuff like that. That is, to me, was the fascinating part. I liked the aspect of learning, and more than anything, I liked making presentations about what I learned. I think my dream role has some mix of that, like to create things for other workers, to make the presentations, but not necessarily try to be the person to attract clients. I think I like the idea of making stuff internally and contributing to the systems and also contributing to like what people know, such as if we're going back to the conversation of beauty, that I liked talking about ingredients and studying how ingredients affect us or their benefits and stuff and how it interacts with the skin and the body. And that's one reason I was just like, maybe I should go back to school, you know? And that was never like, doing extra schooling was never a thought for me, because I thought it would be go to college, find a job, do the job, and I never really thought further about that. And I thought, okay, maybe I could just do with things I liked doing as a hobby, or things I like doing for myself. And then I just realized how much resistance it was, because then with the things I like doing for myself, like writing, even podcasting and stuff like this, of being a creative, to create under restriction just takes away the creativity for me, and that's where I have the most trouble. So that is why that's a sore spot for me, and it's just interesting that she talked about it, because I felt like I should have been more happy about being in my post-grad era. I should have felt happy and successful for graduating, and at some point I was feeling like, why doesn't graduating feel like an accomplishment? Why did having the job I had not feel like an accomplishment or feel like something I could have delved deeper in? And it's because with work, the process of work, I was honestly on autopilot and also very used to the way I did work, which is most of my jobs while being in college was remote work. I don't know how to actually work in an office, work in a space. And then I always resented the idea of commuting, because with commuting, I would typically, my jobs or where they're located is always like over an hour away. So like more than, I would say, it depends on the day, because with school, things took maybe an hour and 10 minutes on a day that was perfect, right? So that was like my minimum, but that's the time on this train and not counting having to walk to the train and stuff like that. And then having like these anxieties about commuting on the train nowadays, it's just not a lot of options besides going on a train. And with being on autopilot, these are things I never thought of, like my career ideals, like what are definite needs for me to do a profession, and what are needs for me to grow, and what are wants in terms of career. You know what I mean? And it's like, when you're in your post-grad era, all you do is have time to think. So then your thoughts are like, did I make a mistake? Is this the right path for me? And then you're so swept up with, because one thing about being in school, and I'm not even just talking about college, but throughout being in school in our lives, we always knew what was coming next. And now when you're out of the era of being a student, you're like, I don't know what's next. And then you have to be constantly proving yourself. And then it's just this overwhelming feeling of this is the first time life is not on autopilot. It's the first time you have to really take the driver's seat. And I think that's why with being a student, there's a lot of identity debts. And then you have to start living more intentionally. You're kind of forced to, but you have to learn how to do it. The last sign of being on autopilot is a lack of awareness about your surroundings. So this one I kind of thought about. I was kind of thinking in the terms like, have you ever seen a movie and a character's like, how come I never noticed you before? Or how come I never noticed this thing before? Or stuff like that. And even if someone was always like in their sphere, but because they were so on autopilot, they never really paid attention to what was really around them that could have been healthier for them. And also, I talked about this not too long ago, but Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry, and how she developed like her friend group her senior year when she's about to graduate, and it's like a month since, and it's like these people have always been around, you know? But because you're living on autopilot and living the way you always lived, you know what I mean? You don't notice what's actually around you. And I just wanted to end off with that one because I feel like it's so important, because we miss out on people, we miss out on opportunities, we miss out on something that could be very great because we're on autopilot. And when you have a lack of awareness about your surroundings, that's how you can tell, and it is a major sign you're on autopilot. To end off, basically, being on autopilot is the difference between living and existing. So I don't know if you guys remember this episode or if you haven't watched that or listened to that. So if you haven't, it's the episode called like Remember to Live, Not Just Exist. And in terms of this, autopilot is existing while intentional living is, well, living. And as I mentioned, it's not always bad to be on autopilot, but if it's repetition of things that are not serving you, then yeah, it's going to make you feel like you're in a rut. It's going to keep you stagnant, and it would be very easy to just blame your circumstances because you're on autopilot. So with intentional living, to live is to be intentional, which sometimes means that we have to have the courage to do that. And what next week's episode, and I'm just going to give a briefing, is going to be about self-love and trust, because I do think when you decide to live intentionally, it takes courage and trust in order to do that, because how can you go about it? How can you change if you don't trust yourself? So that's what next week's episode is going to be about. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And we're going to get into the typical things of the card pull and what I'm grateful for. Okay, so for the card pull, I used the Spirit Animal deck by Kim Kranz. And the card we got was the mouse, which is one of the earth elements. So for the mouse, it says detail-orientated, small-minded, nitpicky, nervous. The mouse has an innate desire to tend to the details. It often spends its days fixing, preparing, organizing, scrutinizing. Unfortunately, a mouse personality doesn't notice when they are going too far. Soon they begin to have a limited and fearful vision of life and try to control every detail. This can be quite a painful experience for both the mouse and those around them. When the mouse energy is at play, step back for a moment. It may be time to find a more purposeful project to delve into, one worthy of your exacting eye. When in balance, organized, resourceful, prepared. When out of balance, busy with no purpose, to bring into balance a meaningful project. So with the mouse card and this episode, I feel like because it talks about like the importance of doing something purposeful, because yes, with intentional living, you have to ask your why and understand why you're doing it. And I do think that can sometimes lead over if you're not in the good mindset of control, or it can lead to hyper focusing on the details, which is why I do think with intentional living, like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, knowing what to be on autopilot about and knowing how to live intentionally needs to have its own special balance, because obviously you don't want to spend your days thinking about every little detail to a point where it kind of prevents you from taking action, but you don't want to just take actions that are not contributing to who you want to become. And yes, sometimes, because I know with the episodes before this, I didn't even listen back to the episode I did for 29, which is going to be the first episode of July, because right now we're still in June. It's the 26th of June. But yes, you can go at a pace, whatever pace you need to. Sometimes you'll need to pick up the pace. Sometimes you'll need to slow it down. It's really depending on the person. But what's important is throughout those times, you're being very intentional and understanding why you need to do that at that speed at that point of time, and also understanding when to shift. And thinking about if what you're doing is contributing really to how you feel joy and feel good about life. So I thought the card was very much spot on, because it reminds us to be purposeful while also reminding us not to fixate overly on the details. And I do think with autopilot, intentional living, that's what exactly you have to do to bring things into balance. And for what I'm grateful for, this is going to sound silly, but what I'm currently grateful for, and I'm going to have it right after I finish this episode, is the watermelon salad. Okay, so I'm typically behind when it comes to trendy things. So the watermelon salad, I didn't make it perfectly because I didn't want to try mint, because I never tried mint leaves. Like I was saying, I just had it with the watermelon, feta cheese, and lime juice. I don't know how I actually feel about watermelon and feta cheese together, but the lime juice on top of the watermelon is so good. I was thinking about that salad all day. But since I'm trying to be more intentional, and especially in terms of food, so yesterday what I ate was that for breakfast with some raspberry leaf tea that I made with sugar-free vanilla syrup and then honey, and then mixed that, and it was so good. But since I'm off of my cramps and everything, and I feel better, so I save my raspberry leaf tea for those days. So since I'm fine today and everything, I don't need that. But then after that, I think it was a cappuccino, because I was a little tired. And then I had lunch, and then later in the day, I ended off with ice cream. So it was a pretty balanced day. It was just like a small ice cream cone, because for some reason, okay, if I go have ice cream, like in a cup from a store, like I don't mind like having it in a cup. But then when it comes to home ice cream, the ones you buy at a store then bring home, I prefer having that ice cream in a cone. And if it's not in a cone, then I don't want to eat it. So that's why every time like my mom would buy ice cream, it's mostly her eating it, and I would not eat it. And plus the flavor she would get. And this time she got a flavor I liked, which is French vanilla, because I'm probably going to get hate for this, but I don't like chocolate ice cream. Like, I like things with chocolate, like Oreo, for example. Or like, at one point I was addicted to cookie dough, but my favorite ice cream, when it came down to it, was, you know, Haagen-Dazs? I think that's how you pronounce it. But the dulce de leche, that ice cream right there was my addiction throughout high school. Like, that was my go-to. That was my favorite. But yeah, I mean, even though my gratitude was more for the watermelon salad thing, I think overall, I've been eating in a pretty balanced way, with a very heavy focus on adding more fruits and vegetables into my diet, like, and getting back into cooking very slowly. The thing I made this week was basically ground beef and cabbage with like all these vegetables, like sometimes mixed vegetables. It was supposed to be like cabbage and carrots, but the carrots were not good. So then I ended up having like mixed vegetables and then tomato. And I had to like kind of separate that out because when you have arthritis, tomato is not the best for you. So then I just put it on the side and have it with mine. And yeah, I've been actually like enjoying going back on Pinterest and finding inspo for cooking and trying to fall back in love with cooking. So yeah, I guess I'm grateful for like that cooking motivation and trying new things again. So that is all for today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're liking like this intentional living type series because that's the vibe I really want to have throughout July, which is kind of why I've been planning in advance for this and everything like that. So I hope you tune into next week's episode. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you're just on where you get your podcast, don't forget to follow the podcast, rate the podcast, and also check out my other content. It would mean the world to me. Have a good day, evening, or night, and I will talk to you in the next one. Okay, bye!